So, exam results day is coming up, and we've been wondering what can we expect when it comes to the results, and especially the attainment gap. You see, this is the second year that exams are back post-COVID after the couple of years when they were taken away for practical reasons. So, like last year, some of the adjustments that were made to courses for pandemic-related disruption, they've been retained, but the traditional exam diet that you would know from before the pandemic, that's kind of pretty much largely intact now. Now, obviously, we don't know what results people are going to get, but do we have any idea what might be going on with the results in general, or in particular, that attainment gap part? Well, maybe. But first, a little bit of context from previous years. So, firstly, this graph here, this shows the attainment gap between the richest and poorest pupils in terms of higher pass rates. This is the 2019 graph. And you can see where the gap stood just before the pandemic hits in 2019, about 17 percentage points. Now, that was a fairly consistent picture. But now, have a look what happened when exams were cancelled in 2020. And yes, that's right, the gap is more than cut in half. 17 percentage points down to about 7. And that really happened, and we should talk about that some more, because you would think it's quite important. What happened there was we took away the exams that we clung to so tightly, and we gave students grades their teachers felt they deserved, rather than the ones that were based on a kind of one-day test. And the gap between rich and poor was halved. Just halved. You can see for yourself. And then the next year, when exams were sort of partially reintroduced, but the use of a kind of set, one-off, make-or-break national timetable wasn't introduced, the gap crept up a little bit, but was still way below historic levels, as you can now see here. So last year, the government and the SQA decided they would restore exams, but they also decided to restore something else, effectively. Because you need to understand that in many ways the final picture of the exam result isn't created by people in exam halls, it's created by decisions made by people in power, not even those doing the marking. It's people somewhere else in other rooms. So for reasons that we don't have time to fully explore as well, moving the pass mark and the grade boundaries around, which is normal, this is a standard thing we always do, it's got quite a potentially big impact on gaps between rich and poor. So in 2022, decisions had to be made about what the final results would look like after exams returned. It wasn't just a case of, we'll restore exams and then just kind of, throw it all out there and just see where the cards lie. That's why the SQA was able to say things like they expected the overall outcomes in 2022 to represent an intermediary position between 2021 and pre-pandemic years. Their awarded methodology report for last year even makes this clear. It explicitly stated that grade boundaries could be lowered in order to achieve, stated goals of outputs from the results. Basically, put simply, if the numbers passing and getting A's and B's aren't right, then they can be made right, or they can be made much closer to right. Now, this was all a part of the move back to normal after all that COVID disruption when, our precious exams couldn't go ahead. And obviously, that would then include a return to some kind of apparently normal attainment gap. Now, I and others actually thought at the time that in 2021 they'd go about halfway back to the old attainment gap levels, but in the end, they actually went even further. And here is what those decisions look like in context. So, as you can see, the attainment gap was nearly doubled last year, taken as an awfully long way back to normal. But what about this year? What's going to happen now? Students this year are sitting exams just like last year, and they have some of the same course adjustments, but they aren't getting the same amount of exam help from the SQA. Not only that, there's still a wee bit of room there for that gap to fully increase back to what you may see as the historic levels. So will it? That was the question I wanted to be able to answer. So I went to the SQA to find out. And I reminded them, 2022 methodology being, talking about this intermediary position between 2021 and pre-pandemic results, and pointed out that the attainment gap last year then did increase, as would have been expected from those earlier statements. And I explained that it seemed then that the next step in that process could be a further increase in the gap this year. It would take it back to those historic levels. So I asked if results this year are likely to see an increased attainment gap in terms of the pass rates between the richest and the poorest pupils, which I thought was fairly straight. So here's the response that I got from an SQA spokesperson. At the heart of our approach to awarding this year is sensitivity to the continuing recovery from the effects of the pandemic. In fairness to learners and to maintain the integrity of our qualifications, we have not set target outcomes for this sensitive approach. Keep that phrase in mind. They then say, we have focused on setting grades and maintaining standards and based on the evidence of learners' performance this year. While it may be anticipated that outcomes for many courses will fall within the range bounded by the 2022 and 2019 outcomes, it's vital that we maintain standards whilst remaining responsive to the ongoing recovery from the pandemic amongst learners. And if you're struggling to figure out exactly what that means, then do not worry, because I am not sure either. It all seems to hang on what exactly they mean by this sensitive approach, right? And this has been trailed for months, this phrase. But we don't actually know what it actually exactly means. At a briefing for journalists, at which the SQA attempted to explain all of this, they were asked directly, more than once, what exactly this means in a practical sense. And they told us that they were showing sensitivity to the experience of learners. And like, yes, okay, but what have you actually done? What does that mean? And we didn't get an answer. Other than the results will come out on the 8th and we'll get to see the outcomes at that point. What we do know is that they haven't taken the performance of any student or school or council into account like in 2020. But we already knew that because grade boundaries are applied at a national level, so obviously decisions around them would use national data. So that isn't anything new. That's not telling us something we don't know. We also know that SQA doesn't see detailed analysis of the impact of results by deprivation until after the grading process. But that's not new information either. And remember that the relationship between changing grade boundaries and attainment gaps is hardly some kind of huge secret, as we already know from the last few years. So I'm afraid we don't actually know what's going to happen with the attainment gap this year. We don't know, maybe the SQA's sensitive approach to grading will end up with more poor pupils failing courses than they did last year. Maybe it'll mean that the attainment gap, which nearly doubled last year when this system was put back in place, maybe it'll continue to grow. Or maybe things will go the other way. Maybe the sensitive approach is going to see a decrease in the gap between the richest and poorest pupils as we apparently take into account the impact of the pandemic on their learning. I suppose we'll just have to wait and see what happens when the results come out next week.